There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a house in the deep of winter, long after the fire has burned down to its last orange breath, when the whole world outside seems to be holding perfectly still. If you know that quiet, you already understand something about tonight's story. Come in from wherever you are, settle into whatever soft and warm thing is holding you right now, and let your mind wander somewhere far away to a small stone house on a hillside, centuries before anyone thought to write down what happened there. In that house, on a night we will return to in a moment, a woman is doing the arithmetic that every parent before her has done in the dark. She counts the grain that remains in the clay jar by the wall. She counts the weeks until the ground softens enough to plant again. She counts the small bodies breathing beside him. And she understands with the plain, unhysterical clarity of someone who has run out of options that she cannot keep them all alive on what she has, not alone. Not without the one person who used to know without being told exactly how to stretch a winter that had already gone wrong. Her name has not survived, the way most names from this world have not survived, but her situation has written into bone and grain and burial soil, told to us by the people who study what gets left behind. And what it tells us gently but insistently is this: for most of human history, a family's chance of making it through a hard year did not rest on two parents alone. It rested on a third kind of person, often overlooked or feared and taken for granted, whose absence could be the difference between a house that survives and a house that does not. Picture her now, this woman whose story opens ours tonight. She is perhaps 26, though no one measured years the way we do, and she is sitting on the packed earth floor of a one-room house with her back against the warm stone of the hearth wall, because that is the only place still holding any heat. Two children sleep near her, curled into the kind of stillness that only exhausted, underfed children fall into, their breathing slow and shallow in the cold air. A third younger lies against her chest, restless, and she shifts her weight without thinking, the way mothers have always shifted their weight, an inherited motion older than language. Her husband died in the autumn of a fever that came on fast and left just as fast, taking him with it. That loss alone she might have carried. Women had carried it before and would again. But 6 weeks after that, in the first hard frost, his mother, who had lived in the loft above them, and who had known in her hands and in her memory exactly which roots stayed sweet through winter and which turned to poison, exactly how to coax a sick child's fever down with the right leaves steeped the right way, exactly how to make 4 weeks of grain stretch into 6. That woman died too quietly in her sleep, the way old age sometimes chooses to end things. And with her went not just a person, but an entire library of survival, one that had never been written down anywhere because it had never needed to be. It had only ever needed to be remembered by someone who was still alive to remember it. This is not, in the end, a story about one winter or even about one family. It is about something that historians and archaeologists have only recently begun to measure properly, something that turns out to be one of the strangest and most defining facts of our species. Human beings are one of the only creatures on this earth who reliably live for decades after they are no longer able to have children of their own. Almost nothing else in the animal world does this, and for a long time nobody could quite explain why evolution would allow it, why a body would keep going, keep working, keep useful long after its original biological purpose had ended. The answer, when it finally came into focus, was quieter and more moving than anyone expected. It had to do with grandmothers and grandfathers. It had to do with exactly the kind of person that the woman in our story had just lost. If any of this is the kind of thing you find yourself thinking about quietly in the dark, then you are exactly the right person for what is coming tonight. Before we go further, it would mean a great deal if you took just a moment to follow along and let others know this story exists wherever you happen to be listening from tonight. And if you feel like it, leave a note about where in the world you are and what drew you to a story like this one. I genuinely like reading them. Get comfortable, pull the blanket up a little higher if you need to, and let's go back to that house on the hillside and to the much older, much larger story it belongs to. Because what happened in that small room in the cold is not an isolated tragedy. It is a single instance of a pattern that repeats itself across thousands of years and thousands of villages, a pattern historians have only recently learned to read properly in parish registers and skeletal remains and the quiet mathematics of who lived and who did not. The woman on the hillside did not know she was part of something larger. She only knew that the grain was low, that her children were thin, and that the person who used to know what to do was gone. What she could not have known, and what we are only now beginning to understand with any real precision, is how much of human history itself was quietly held together by people exactly like her mother-in-law. Grandmothers who kept working long after their own children were grown, grandfathers who taught and mended and remembered, an entire hidden architecture of survival built not on parents alone, but on the presence of an older generation standing just behind them. Scholars still debate exactly how large that effect was in any single household, and the honest truth is that we will never have a precise number for how many winters were lost or won because of one grandmother's memory. But the broader pattern is no longer in doubt. It shows up again and again in the length of human childhood, in the strange fact of human menopause itself, in burial sites where 3 generations lie close together, in records where a household with a living grandparent simply, quietly statistically tends to lose fewer children than one without. We are going to spend the next several hours inside that pattern. We will go back to the deep evolutionary puzzle of why humans alone among most primates evolved to keep their oldest members alive and present for so long after their working years should have ended. We will walk through the villages and households where that presence shaped nearly everything: food, safety, memory, medicine. We will sit with the moments when that presence was suddenly catastrophically taken away, and watch what happened to the families left behind. And we will follow the quiet, persistent echo of all of it into the world we live in now, where the instinct that built that ancient system has never entirely gone away. But it begins here in the small stone house in the cold, with a woman doing arithmetic in the dark, missing the person who would have known exactly what to do. Somewhere in the long, slow accumulation of human evolution, something happened that should not have happened. At least not according to the ordinary rules that govern nearly every other creature on this planet. A body that could no longer produce offspring kept living, kept working, kept mattering, and it happened again and again across generation after generation until it became one of the strangest and most defining features of our entire species. To understand why that matters, it helps to sit for a moment with an uncomfortable fact about being human, one that most of us never stop to consider because we have simply always lived inside it. Human children are, by the standards of the animal kingdom, almost absurdly slow to grow up. A young elephant can walk within hours of birth. A foal can run within a day. A human infant cannot even hold its own head steady for months, cannot walk for a year, cannot feed itself reliably for several years after that, and remains by any honest measure a net drain on the resources of the adults around it for well over a decade. No other primate asks this much of its parents for this long. A chimpanzee is largely self-sufficient by the age of 7 or 8. A human child at that age is still years away from being able to gather enough food to feed even itself. This creates what researchers sometimes call the burden of the slow child, and it is a burden that on paper should have made human beings a spectacular evolutionary failure. 2 exhausted parents trying to keep 1 or 2 of these enormously demanding, enormously slow-maturing children alive in a world full of predators, disease, and unpredictable seasons is a fragile arrangement. It does not take much to break it. A hunting accident, a difficult second pregnancy, a single bad harvest. The mathematics of survival for early humans simply do not work if the household only ever contains 2 working adults and their offspring. And yet humans did not fail. We spread across nearly every landmass on Earth, thrived in deserts and ice fields and dense forests, and became by most measures one of the most successful mammals this planet has ever produced. For a long time, the explanations offered for this success focused on the obvious things: tool use, language, cooperation between unrelated groups. All of that mattered enormously, but it left a puzzle unsolved. None of it explained why human females, alone among almost all primates, would stop being able to reproduce roughly halfway through their natural lifespan and then simply keep living often for decades more. In most of the animal world, this pattern does not exist. Female chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, generally remain fertile until very near the end of their lives. The same is true of most mammals studied in any detail. A body that can no longer pass on its own genes directly is, in the cold logic of natural selection, a body that should have little reason to keep receiving the resources needed to survive. And yet human grandmothers across cultures and across thousands of years did exactly that. They kept eating, they kept needing shelter and warmth and care, and evolution, which rarely tolerates waste for long, allowed it to continue generation after generation for what appears to be hundreds of thousands of years. The explanation that has gained the most traction among researchers who study this question is deceptively simple once you hear it, though. It took decades of careful, patient work to piece together. A woman who stops having her own children does not stop contributing to the survival of her family's genetic line. She simply redirects that contribution. Instead of investing her remaining years and energy into one more infant of her own, who would face the same long, fragile road to independence that all human infants face, she invests it into the children her daughters or daughters-in-law are already struggling to raise. She gathers food, she watches children while their parents work, she knows from decades of accumulated experience which plants heal and which harm, which berries are safe in a lean season, and which are not how to calm a fevered child through the worst of a long night. In doing so, she does not just help one grandchild survive. Often, she frees her daughter to have another child sooner, and to keep that child and the ones before it alive as well. Researchers who have studied this pattern in surviving hunter-gatherer societies, most famously among certain communities where older women remain remarkably active, well into their later decades found something that quietly rearranged how anthropologists thought about the value of old age. In these communities, the oldest women in the group were often the single most productive food gatherers of anyone young or old, not despite their age, but in some ways because of it. Decades of accumulated knowledge about where to find food in a bad season, how to dig for roots that younger, stronger women had never learned to locate, translated into a level of daily output that consistently rivaled or exceeded that of women in their prime reproductive years. It was not brute strength that made them valuable. It was memory. This idea has become known informally as the grandmother hypothesis, and it offers one of the more compelling explanations for why human females evolved to live so far past their fertile years, while so few other species do. It does not claim to explain everything, and scholars still debate how much of human longevity can be credited to this single mechanism versus other overlapping pressures, including changes in diet, cooperative hunting, and the deep advantages of extended social learning across generations. The evidence remains genuinely incomplete on many of the finer points, and researchers continue to argue over exact timelines and exact causes. But the broader shape of the idea has held up remarkably well under decades of scrutiny, and it offers something rare in the study of deep prehistory, a plausible, moving explanation for a fact that had puzzled scientists for a very long time. There is something worth sitting with in this quietly for a moment. It suggests that grandparents were not a late invention of settled agricultural life, a comfortable addition that appeared once humans built houses and stayed in one place. It suggests instead that they may be one of the oldest and most fundamental features of what it means to be human at all, present around the fires of hunter-gatherer bands tens of thousands of years before anyone planted a single seed or built a single wall. The old woman minding a toddler while its mother gathered roots, the old man teaching a boy how to read animal tracks in the dust. These were not luxuries. They were in a very real sense load-bearing parts of the entire human survival system present from close to the very beginning. And once that system existed, once human communities came to depend generation after generation on the presence of that third and fourth adult standing just behind the parents, something else began to happen. It became embedded not just in biology but in the structure of daily life itself. Households organized around it. Traditions grew up to protect it. Entire social roles formed to make sure that knowledge, that labor, that steady patient presence would be there for as many families as possible for as long as possible. Which raises the question of what that presence actually looked like once human beings stopped simply surviving in small bands and began building something larger, something more settled, something with walls around it and fields stretching out beyond the door. Because it is there in those early villages, in those first fixed households, that the shape of the grandparents' role becomes most visible, most concrete, and most easy to see in the lives of ordinary people who left almost no other record of themselves behind. There is a particular kind of evidence that historians love more than almost any other, not because it is dramatic, but because it is boring in exactly the right way. Tax records, household inventories, lists of who lived under which roof and who ate from which pot. These documents were never meant to tell a story. They were meant to count things for the purposes of grain levies or inheritance disputes or the practical business of governing. And it is precisely because they were never meant to be poetic that they end up being some of the most honest windows we have into how ordinary families actually lived thousands of years ago, long before anyone thought their daily routines were worth writing down for their own sake. What those records show again and again across an extraordinary range of early farming societies is something that might surprise anyone who assumes the nuclear family, just two parents and their children under one roof, is the natural default of human history. It is not. For most of the time humans have lived in settled villages, the ordinary household looked different. It often held 3 generations at once, or something close to it. A married couple, their children, and somewhere within the same walls or the same small cluster of buildings, an aging parent or two no longer strong enough to plough a field alone, but very much present, very much working, and very much essential to the operation of the household as a whole. Consider the layout of an early farming settlement uncovered by archaeologists working. Sites from the Neolithic period in parts of Europe where houses were built long and narrow, sometimes stretching 30 or 40 feet, divided into sections by function rather than by family unit. In several of these excavated sites, researchers found something unexpected sitting within the domestic debris. The discarded tools, the burned hearth remains the broken pottery. The wear patterns on certain grinding stones, the kind used daily to process grain into something edible, showed signs consistent with use by hands that had done this specific motion for decades, a level of polish and groove depth that younger hands simply had not had time to produce. In household after household, it appears the person doing the single most repetitive, most essential daily task, turning raw grain into food that could actually keep a family alive, was not the strongest adult in the house. It was very often the oldest. This detail matters more than it might first appear, because grinding grain was not a minor chore. In many early agricultural societies, it consumed hours of labour every single day, labour that, if it fell on the shoulders of a working-age mother, would have pulled her away from childcare, from fieldwork, from a dozen other tasks that could not simply wait. Historians who study early village economies have come to understand something that earlier generations of scholars sometimes overlooked, focused as they were on hunting, farming and warfare as the dramatic centerpieces of ancient life. The invisible labour of the old grinding, mending, minding, cooking, watching was often what made everything else possible. Without it, the whole fragile machine of a farming household simply could not run. The role went well beyond food preparation. In societies without written language, and even in many that had writing but reserved it for the wealthy and the powerful, an elder's memory functioned as something close to a living archive. This is not a poetic exaggeration. It is closer to a literal description of how knowledge survived from one generation to the next, before printed almanacs, before agricultural extension offices, before any of the institutions we now take for granted for storing and transmitting practical knowledge. The only reliable repository for information like which seed varieties survived a late frost, which wild plants could treat a persistent cough, which berries looked edible but were not, was a person. Usually an older person. Usually someone who had lived through enough seasons, enough failed harvests, enough sick winters, to have accumulated a working knowledge that no single younger adult could possibly have gathered on their own. There is a particularly striking illustration of this in the historical record of certain rural communities in early medieval Europe, where local custom sometimes required a newly married couple to continue living within or very near the household of one set of parents for a period of years, not simply out of sentiment or tradition for its own sake, but because it functioned as a kind of unofficial apprenticeship. A young wife arriving in an unfamiliar village, often as a teenager, had almost no independent knowledge of the local land, the local weather patterns, the particular quirks of the specific fields and forests she now depended on for survival. Her new mother-in-law, difficult as that relationship could sometimes be, and difficult it very often was according to surviving letters, court records, and the occasional bitter proverb passed down through the centuries, nonetheless represented her single fastest path to understanding how to keep her own children fed and healthy in this new place. The knowledge transfer was not always warm, it was not always welcome, but it was in an extraordinarily concrete sense a matter of survival, and communities structured themselves around making sure it happened. Grandfathers carried a different though equally essential version of this same function. In many agrarian and pastoral societies, an older man past his years of heaviest physical labour often became the primary keeper of a family's practical and legal knowledge. Which boundary stone marked the edge of which field which neighbouring family had a decades-old grudge worth avoiding, how to read the coming weather in the behaviour of animals or the colour of a sunset. Skills built entirely from a long accumulation of lived observation. In pastoral communities that depended on herding animals across shared or contested land, an elder who remembered exactly where water could still be found during a drought that had last occurred 30 years earlier could in a very literal sense save an entire flock and by extension an entire family's livelihood. None of this means every household with a living grandparent thrived or that every household without one collapsed. The historical picture is messier and more human than that. Scholars who study historical demography are careful to point out that the evidence remains genuinely incomplete when it comes to precisely quantifying how much any single grandparent's presence changed a specific family's odds of survival in a specific year. Poverty, local politics, disease, and simple chance all played their own enormous roles, and no responsible historian would claim that grandparents alone determined who lived and who did not. But the broader pattern drawn from parish records, from archaeological household layouts, from surviving legal codes that specifically protected the property and status of elders within a family structure points consistently in one direction. Communities that had access to a working present older generation tended on the whole to be more resilient than those that did not, and communities seemed to understand this themselves intuitively long before anyone wrote it down as a formal observation. It shows up in how thoroughly so many early legal systems protected the rights and standing of the elderly within a household not out of sentiment, but because the alternative, a family stripped of that older presence, was widely understood to be more fragile. There is a quiet irony worth sitting with here, one that becomes clearer the longer you look at it. In the modern world, old age is so often framed as a period of decline, of diminishing usefulness, of stepping back from the centre of things. For most of human history, the opposite was closer to true. The oldest members of a household were frequently among its most economically productive people, not despite their years, but because of everything those years had taught them. Their value did not come from strength which had long since faded. It came from memory, patience, and the accumulated weight of having already survived what the younger members of the household had not yet faced. And that raises an uncomfortable question one this story will need to sit with more directly before long. If an elder's presence carried this much practical weight, if their knowledge and labour were woven this deeply into the daily survival of ordinary families, then what happened to a household when that presence reached its full extent, when a family was fortunate enough to have not just one grandparent, but the fullest version of that support, elders still strong enough to work, still sharp enough to remember, still present enough to hold the whole fragile structure together at its very best? That fuller picture of households at the height of what this arrangement could provide is where the story turns next into homes, where the old did not simply survive on the margins, but stood quite literally at the centre of everything. Picture for a moment not a village in the abstract, not a scattering of archaeological sites across a map, but a single house on a single morning somewhere in the countryside of what is now southern Germany sometime in the 1200s. This is where the story needs to slow down and actually live for a while, because it is one thing to say that grandparenthood mattered to pre-industrial families and quite another to see what that actually looked like hour by hour inside four walls. The house itself would seem to modernise startlingly small for the number of people inside it. A single main room, perhaps 20 feet across, served as kitchen, workshop, dining space, and for at least part of the household bedroom as well. Smoke from the hearth fire finds its way out through a gap near the roofline rather than a proper chimney, which means the air inside carries a permanent, not unpleasant haze, and everyone's clothing, hair, and skin holds the faint scent of wood smoke at all times. Surviving records from manorial courts and church registers across this period, patchy as they are, allow historians to reconstruct something close to a typical household of this kind, and what they find is instructive. In this house lives a couple in their late 20s, their 4 children ranging from an infant to a boy of 9, and in the loft space above, reached by a fixed ladder, rather than proper stairs, the husband's mother, a widow in her mid-50s, an age that in this period already marked her as notably old, though not unusually so. She is not a guest. She is not being cared for out of obligation in the way a modern household might quietly absorb the cost of supporting an aging relative. She is, in the plainest economic sense, one of the household's most productive members, and everyone under that roof understands it, even if none of them would have phrased it in those terms. Her day begins before dawn, tending the fire that has been kept low but alive through the night, a task that required a specific learned skill banking coals correctly, so they would still hold heat by morning without consuming the household's entire wood supply overnight. This alone represents a small but real form of expertise, the kind that took years to master, and that if done badly meant either a cold house or a dangerously fast-burning fire. From there, her morning moves into the grinding of grain, a task that, as we have already seen frequently, fell to older household members whose hands had done the motion so many thousands of times that the work had become almost automatic, freeing their minds for other things even as their bodies continued the labour. But grinding grain and tending fires were only the visible portion of what she provided. The less visible portion, and in many ways the more valuable one, was her role as the household's primary source of medical knowledge. This is a detail that surprises many people encountering it for the first time, because the popular image of medieval medicine tends to focus on trained physicians, most of them male, most of them serving wealthy patrons in towns and cities, working from Latin texts most ordinary families would never see. For the overwhelming majority of the rural population, actual medical care came from somewhere else, entirely from women. Exactly like the grandmother in this household, whose knowledge had been passed down orally, refined through decades of trial error and careful observation, and applied within the family itself, usually at no cost beyond the labour of gathering the right plants at the right time. Surviving herbals, several of which were eventually written down by literate monks or nuns who had gathered their information from exactly these kinds of informal oral traditions, describe remedies for fever, for digestive trouble, for the aches of overworked joints. Remedies that modern pharmacological research has, in a fair number of cases, found to contain genuinely active compounds: willow bark for pain, chamomile for digestive distress, various preparations that, however unscientific their explanations sounded at the time, were not simply superstition. They worked often enough because someone had spent decades quietly testing what worked and what did not, and had passed that hard-won understanding down to whoever in the next generation was paying close enough attention. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it reframes something easy to get wrong about this period. It is tempting to imagine medieval households as passively suffering through illness, with no real recourse beyond prayer and luck. And prayer certainly played its part in a world that understood sickness partly through a religious lens. But alongside that, quietly in nearly every household with an older woman present, there existed a working, empirically refined body of medical practice, unwritten, uncredentialed, and almost entirely unrecorded by the official institutions of the time, yet responsible for keeping an enormous number of ordinary people alive through illnesses that without any intervention at all might well have killed them. The children in this household meanwhile spent a considerable portion of their day under their grandmother's direct supervision, not as a matter of convenience but as a structural necessity. Their mother's labour was needed elsewhere in the fields during planting and harvest seasons, in the dairy work that fell almost universally to women in this period in the endless list of tasks required simply to keep a household functioning. Someone had to watch the younger children, teach the older ones the beginnings of the skills they would need as adults, and manage the countless small dangers of a household built around open, fast, sharp tools and animals kept close to the living space. That someone in an overwhelming number of documented cases across pre-industrial Europe was the household's oldest woman. It's worth pausing here to ask a fair question, one that a careful listener might already be forming. Was this arrangement chosen freely out of affection and mutual support, or was it simply an economic necessity that happened to look from a distance like family closeness? The honest answer, and historians studying this period are careful to say so, is that it was almost certainly both tangled together in ways that resist easy separation. Affection and economic interdependence are not opposites. In a world where survival genuinely depended on cooperation across generations, love and necessity grew up together, each reinforcing the other, until it becomes almost impossible looking back from this distance to say where one ended and the other began. What can be said with more confidence is this: households structured this way, with an active working older generation present day to day, functioned as remarkably efficient systems distributing labour according to what each body could actually do well at each stage of life, rather than expecting the same tasks from everyone, regardless of age or strength. The grandmother in the loft was not simply being kept alive out of sentiment. She was in the truest sense still working, still essential, still holding up her share of a structure that could not easily function without her. And this is precisely what makes the next part of this story so difficult to sit with, because a structure this interconnected, this dependent on every piece remaining in place, was also by its very nature extraordinarily fragile. A household built so completely around the presence of its oldest members carried within it a quiet, unspoken vulnerability, one that most families never had cause to think about directly until the day they did. Because history, as it turns out, was not always kind enough to let that older generation simply grow old in peace. Every system built around interdependence carries a hidden question inside it, one that rarely gets asked until circumstances force it into the open. What happens when one piece is removed? A household organized so completely around the presence of an older generation, as we have just seen, worked beautifully when all its parts remained in place. But history rarely allows anything to remain in place for long, and the pressures that could pull an elder away from a family permanently, quietly, without any single dramatic event to mark the moment, were numerous, and they'd been building for a very long time before anyone thought to notice the pattern. Consider first something that rarely appears in the popular imagination of pre-industrial family life: the sheer scale of internal migration. It is easy to picture medieval and early modern villages as static generation after generation, living and dying within sight of the same church tower, the same fields, the same neighbours their grandparents had known. For a meaningful portion of the population, this was simply not true. Younger sons in societies where land passed to a single heir frequently had no choice but to leave seeking work as labourers, apprentices, or soldiers in places far from where they were born. Daughters in many regions married into households in neighbouring villages, sometimes travelling only a few miles, but in a world without fast transportation or regular communication, even a distance of 10 or 15 miles could functionally sever a young family from the older generation that might otherwise have supported them. Records from parish and manorial archives across parts of early modern England reveal something historians did not fully appreciate until relatively recently: that rates of geographic mobility among the rural poor were considerably higher than earlier scholarship assumed. Servants, labourers, and young married couples moved with real frequency, chasing work, fleeing debt, or simply following wherever a landholder needed hands that season. Each of these moves, individually unremarkable, collectively represents a slow, steady thinning of exactly the kind of multi-generational household we spent the last part sitting inside. A young mother who moves 20 miles from her own mother and mother-in-law to follow her husband's work has not experienced a tragedy in the way a death would register as one, but she has lost just as completely the accumulated knowledge and daily labour that a present grandparent would have provided. The loss simply arrives quietly, without a funeral, without anyone marking the date. War produced its own more brutal version of this same thinning, though it worked through a mechanism that might surprise you. It is tempting to assume that war primarily threatened the young, the soldiers themselves, and of course it did. But the conscription and displacement caused by prolonged conflict frequently pulled apart households in ways that stripped away the older generation just as effectively as it endangered the young. Consider the patterns that repeats across numerous documented conflicts in early modern Europe, where invading or occupying forces requisitioned homes, forcing entire communities to relocate, sometimes permanently. In the chaos of displacement, it was very often the oldest members of a family, those least able to travel quickly, least able to survive the exposure and hunger of a forced march, who did not survive the journey even when younger family members did. A family fleeing a burning village might arrive at a place of relative safety, having lost along the way not a soldier, but a grandmother too frail to keep pace left behind, or simply unable to endure conditions her body could no longer withstand. There is a specific and somewhat startling detail buried in the demographic records of several early modern refugee crises, one that surprises people encountering it for the first time. In multiple documented instances of mass displacement across this period, the age structure of surviving refugee populations skews noticeably younger than the population they fled from, not because the young were specifically protected, but because the physical demands of displacement itself, the walking, the exposure, the irregular and inadequate food disproportionately claimed the oldest bodies first. War, in other words, did not need to kill an elder directly to remove them from a family's life. It simply needed to make ordinary daily survival slightly harder than an aging body could bear. Then there is a pressure that operated even in peaceful settled communities, one woven so deeply into the economics of pre-industrial life that it rarely gets discussed as a threat to the older generation at all indentured service and long-term labour contracts. Across much of early modern Europe and in the American colonies as well, it was common for teenagers and young adults, particularly from poorer families, to be sent away from home for extended periods, sometimes 7 years or more, bound to a master craftsman, a farmer, or a household in a distant town, learning a trade or simply providing labour in exchange for room board and eventual small payment. This practice served an important economic function, and in many cases it genuinely benefited the families involved, reducing the number of mouths to feed at home and offering young people a path toward eventual independence. But it also meant that for the duration of these arrangements, an aging parent back in the home village lost access to exactly the kind of younger household support that might otherwise have helped sustain a multi-generational home. And the arrangement worked in the other direction too quietly, in a way that receives even less attention. An older widow or widower, unable to maintain an independent household alone, was sometimes taken in not by their own children, who might be scattered across several distant towns through exactly this kind of labour migration, but by a more distant relative, or in the absence of any willing family member by a parish poorhouse, an institution that existed in various forms across England and much of continental Europe specifically to absorb the elderly and infirm who had no household left to support them. Scholars who study the history of parish welfare systems still debate how common this outcome actually was relative to the more commonly imagined picture of elders living out their final years, surrounded by children and grandchildren. The evidence remains genuinely incomplete, pieced together from fragmentary parish relief records that vary enormously in quality and survival from one region to another. But what those records do make clear consistently is that the poorhouse and the parish relief system were not marginal institutions invented as an afterthought. They existed at meaningful scale precisely because the multi-generational household, for all its deep cultural and practical importance, was never as universal or as stable in practice as it appears in the idealized version of pre-industrial family life that sometimes gets told today. Is it fair then to say that the world of the previous part, that warm functioning household with its grandmother in the loft, was somehow a fiction, a rosy exception rather than the norm? Not quite. It was real, and it was common enough that its absence when it occurred registered clearly in the historical record as a measurable hardship. But it was also fragile in ways that families rarely had the luxury of forgetting. Migration for work, the disruptions of war, the long absences created by indentured labour, all of these quietly gradually pulled at the threads holding the multi-generational household together, long before any single dramatic catastrophe arrived to test what remained. And a catastrophe was coming, one so large and so thorough in its reach across Europe that it would not simply pull at these threads one household at a time the way migration or a hard winter might. It would in a matter of months tear through entire regions at once, and in doing so it would leave behind a kind of evidence that historians are still working through today. Evidence of exactly what happened to families and to entire villages when the oldest generation vanished, not gradually, household by household, but all at once in a single terrible season. There is a specific kind of silence that archaeologists and historians have learned to read in the record of the 14th century, a silence that shows up not in what people wrote, because for the most part they were in no condition to write anything, but in what stopped. Court records that had been kept faithfully for decades suddenly break off mid-year. Tax rolls list households, then simply fail to list them again the following season. Land that had been farmed continuously for generations appears within a matter of months as ownerless, waiting for someone to claim it. That silence belongs to the Black Death, the plague that swept across Europe and much of Asia, beginning in the late 1240s, and it remains one of the most thoroughly studied catastrophes in human history precisely because its scale left behind so much to study. It would be easy, and it would also be wrong, to tell this part of the story as though the plague specifically hunted the old. It did not. This is worth saying plainly because the disease itself, caused by a bacterium carried largely by fleas living on rodents, showed no particular preference for age. Historical and modern epidemiological analysis of plague mortality makes clear that people of every age died in enormous numbers. Infants, young adults in the prime of their strength, the middle-aged and the elderly alike. In many affected communities, mortality among younger adults was, if anything, comparably devastating, since a population's largest working-age cohort simply represented the largest number of bodies exposed to infection in daily life, labouring in fields, tending markets, caring for the sick. What makes this part of the story worth sitting with, then, is not a claim that the plague targeted the old specifically. It is something quieter, and in its own way more unsettling. The particular consequence that unfolded whenever an elderly household member happened to be among the dead in a system that, as we have already seen, depended so heavily on exactly that person's continued presence. A plague that killed indiscriminately still left behind households where the surviving structure had been broken in a very specific way, and it is in those broken households that some of the clearest evidence for everything discussed earlier in this story becomes visible. Consider what historians have pieced together from surviving manorial records in parts of rural England during and immediately after the worst plague years. In villages where mortality reached its documented peaks, sometimes claiming close to half the population within a single terrible season, the records that survive show something beyond the raw death toll itself. They show a wave of what clerks at the time recorded in the flat administrative language of the period as households left without governance, meaning families in which no adult remained who held the accumulated local knowledge, the legal standing, or simply the practical experience needed to manage a farm, a herd, or a set of children through the seasons that followed. In a meaningful number of these cases, the household had not lost every adult. A young mother might survive, perhaps even a young father, but the elder generation, whoever within that particular household had happened to fall to the disease, was gone, and with them went exactly the kind of knowledge this story has spent its first several parts describing. Here the human cost becomes difficult to look away from, and it is worth naming clearly without flinching, in keeping with what this channel promises. Surviving coroners' records and parish accounts from the years immediately following major plague outbreaks show elevated rates of what contemporaries sometimes called wasting among the surviving children of households that had lost their older generation. Children who lived through the plague itself only to face a harder winter than they otherwise might have cared for by parents who were themselves grieving, exhausted, and in many cases missing the specific practical knowledge that an aunt, an uncle, or a grandparent would ordinarily have provided. This was not universal. Many families adapted, leaned on neighbours, remarried quickly, absorbed orphaned relatives into existing households in patterns that historians have traced through surviving wills and parish registers. Human resilience in the aftermath of the plague was in its own way remarkable, and deserves to be told honestly alongside the hardship. But the adaptation itself is evidence of the gap it was adapting to fill. One detail from this period surprises many people encountering it for the first time, and it concerns not tragedy but a strange unintended consequence. In several regions of post-plague Europe, wages for surviving labourers rose sharply, sometimes dramatically, simply because the population had shrunk so severely that labour itself became scarce and valuable in a way it had not been for generations. This economic shift, studied extensively by historians of the period, eventually helped erode some of the rigid feudal structures that had defined rural life for centuries, as surviving peasants found themselves able to negotiate for better terms or to abandon a manor entirely for a better offer, elsewhere options that would have been unthinkable before the plague reduced the available workforce so drastically. It is a strange kind of consequence to sit with an entire social order gradually loosening in the wake of a catastrophe, not because anyone intended it, but because the arithmetic of who remained to do the work had changed so completely. That same shift, though, carried its own quiet cost for exactly the kind of multi-generational household this story has been tracing. As surviving young labourers found new opportunities in distant villages and towns willing to leave behind the manor their family had worked for generations in exchange for better wages elsewhere, the same forces of migration described earlier accelerated considerably in the plague's aftermath. A young man who might once have stayed near his aging mother, inheriting the family plot and supporting her through her final years, now had a genuine tempting alternative, a nearby town offering wages that had been unimaginable a decade earlier. Some stayed, many did not. The plague, in other words, did not simply remove elders from households directly through death. It also loosened permanently in many regions the economic bonds that had once kept younger family members tethered close enough to provide that support in the first place. Historians studying this period still debate how much of the long gradual decline of the traditional multi-generational rural household across the following centuries can be traced back to this single catastrophic period, versus other slower moving forces already in motion before the plague ever arrived. Urbanization, the early stirrings of a market economy shifting inheritance customs. The evidence remains genuinely incomplete, and no single cause explains everything that followed across such a vast and varied continent. But the plague years offer historians something rare, a moment of such sudden sweeping disruption that its effects on family structure are unusually visible in the surviving record compressed into a handful of terrible years rather than spread thin across centuries where cause and effect become nearly impossible to separate. Is it strange to think that a catastrophe remembered mostly for its horror also quietly reshaped forever the shape of the ordinary family across an entire continent? Perhaps it should not be. Very little in history moves in a straight line, and even the darkest chapters tend to leave behind consequences that ripple outward in direction no one at the time could have predicted, reaching households and generations who never lived through the disaster itself, yet inherited its aftermath all the same. What remains once the worst of the plague years passed, and Europe's population slowly unevenly began to recover, is a question this story has not yet answered. Directly, though, every part so far has been quietly building toward it. What did it actually feel like from the inside to be a child growing up in exactly one of these households in the years when the old were gone and no one remained who remembered what they had known? That is where this story turns next into the daily, lived texture of growing up without the person who was supposed to be there. A child who loses a parent is given a word for what they have become. The language itself has always understood that particular grief needs a name, and so an orphan is orphaned, a widow is widowed, and everyone around them understands instantly what kind of loss they are looking at. But a child who grows up with parents living and working and present, yet without a grandparent to carry them through their earliest years, has no word at all. Nothing marks that loss. No mourning ritual acknowledges it. And that more than almost anything else in this story is what makes it so easy to miss, both for the people living through it centuries ago and for the historians trying to understand it now. It helps to sit with what specifically disappears when that presence disappears, because it is rarely the obvious things. A household that loses its grandmother does not usually starve immediately, not if the parents are healthy and the harvest is decent. What it loses first is subtler and slower to reveal itself. It loses the particular knowledge of this child, this specific small person, the kind of understanding that only comes from having already raised one generation and having the patience and the free hands to closely observe the next. A working mother exhausted from field labour and pregnant again within the year, as she very often was, simply does not have the same capacity to notice that a toddler's cough sounds different this week than it did last week, or that a baby who used to nurse eagerly has grown strangely listless. An elder, freed from the heaviest physical labour, but still very much present in the daily rhythm of the house, often had exactly that capacity. Historians who study patterns of childhood mortality across early modern parish records have noted something that took considerable time to interpret correctly, that households recorded as containing a resident grandparent show with real consistency across multiple regions and time periods, somewhat lower rates of infant and early childhood death than otherwise comparable household without one. The gap is not enormous in any single parish, and scholars are careful to note that the evidence remains genuinely incomplete, tangled up with wealth, local disease patterns, and simple chance in ways that resist any single tidy explanation. But the pattern recurs often enough across enough different times and places that it is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. What made the difference in the households where researchers can trace it most clearly was rarely a single dramatic act of medical intervention. It was accumulation. A grandmother who had already lost children of her own and had watched enough neighbours lose theirs, developed an instinct for which symptoms mattered and which did not, when to worry and when to simply wait out a passing fever. That instinct could not be taught quickly. It could not be written down in a way that fully captured it, though some of it eventually was in the herbals and household manuals that began circulating more widely in later centuries. It had to be lived into over years through the accumulation of small observations that no textbook could replicate, and no single overworked mother, however loving, had the time or the rested attention to build on her own. There is a specific and genuinely surprising detail buried in demographic research on this period, one that reframes how we should think about childhood in household missing this presence. Several studies of early modern European populations have found that the effect of a missing grandparent shows up most clearly not in the risk of any single dramatic illness, but in something more diffuse general markers of childhood nutrition and physical development recoverable from skeletal remains. Researchers examining burial sites from this period have found measurable differences in indicators like adult height and bone density between individuals who, based on associated household records, appear to have grown up in multi-generational homes versus those who did not. The differences are modest, a matter of centimetres, and small variations in bone density, rather than anything dramatic, but they are consistent enough across enough excavated populations to suggest something real was happening at the level of everyday nutrition and care, something too gradual and too ordinary to have ever been written down as a notable event in anyone's lifetime, yet visible now, centuries later, in the bones themselves. Beyond nutrition and health, though, there was a different kind of loss, harder to measure, but no less real. And this is the layer of the story that deserves the most careful attention here. A child raised without an elder in the household did not simply lose a caretaker. They lost a specific relationship to time itself, a living connection to a world that existed before their parents were born. Grandparents in nearly every documented pre-industrial culture functioned as the primary tellers of family and communal history, the ones who remembered the flood before the last flood, the famine before the last famine, the way things had been handled the last time something like this happened. This was not idle storytelling. It was, in a very real sense, a form of disaster. Preparedness passed down not as formal instruction but as memory offered, almost casually in the course of ordinary days. Consider what happens to a community's collective memory when that transmission breaks. A village that loses its oldest generation, whether gradually through migration and labour patterns or suddenly through catastrophe, does not simply lose individual people. It loses its only functioning record of the last severe drought, the last time the river flooded this high, the last outbreak of a particular illness, and what, if anything, had seemed to help. Younger survivors, however capable and resourceful, were left rebuilding that knowledge from scratch, sometimes making the same costly mistakes their grandparents' generation had already learned to avoid simply because no one remained who remembered the lesson. Historians studying the recovery period following major regional disruptions have found scattered but suggestive evidence of exactly this pattern. Communities that, having lost their older generation, appear to repeat mistakes in land management or food storage that their own written and oral traditions intact elsewhere show had already been solved a generation or two earlier. Is it fair to call this the true cost of a missing grandparent, greater even than the measurable gaps in childhood nutrition or survival? Perhaps it is closer to say that it was the invisible cost underneath the visible ones, the reason those visible gaps existed at all. A society or a single household is only ever as resilient as its accumulated memory allows it to be, and memory before writing became common and reliable among ordinary families, lived nowhere except inside the bodies and minds of people old enough to have already lived through hard things once before. None of this suggests that children raised without a grandparent's presence were doomed, or that their parents somehow failed them. The historical record is full of families who adapted, who leaned more heavily on neighbours, on godparents, on the broader web of community relationships this story will turn to shortly. Resilience took many forms, and human beings across every century this story has moved through so far proved remarkably capable of building new structures when the old ones broke. But those substitutes, however resourceful, were rarely quite the same as the thing they replaced, and the households that had to build them left behind in parish records and skeletal remains, and the quiet gaps in local memory, a clear enough trace of exactly what had gone missing, and exactly how much work it took to compensate for its absence. It's worth pausing here on something that connects this loss to the very beginning of tonight's story, back to the woman doing arithmetic in the cold, missing the person who would have known what to do. What she was mourning in that quiet moment was never really about grain or fever or the specific tasks her mother-in-law used to perform. It was about the absence of a kind of knowing that only comes from having lived long enough to have already survived something like this once before. And now, with that human cost laid out plainly, it becomes worth asking a harder, more careful question, one that takes this story out of the realm of pattern and inference, and into the realm of hard evidence, the kind that can actually be measured, counted and weighed against everything assumed so far. There is a research technique historians call family reconstitution, and it sounds on first hearing almost mechanical, the kind of phrase that belongs in a laboratory rather than a story about grandmothers and cold winters. But what it actually involves is something closer to patient, painstaking detective work, the kind that takes a single overworked researcher years to complete for even one parish. It means taking every surviving baptism record, every marriage record, every burial record from a single English or French village, sometimes spanning 2 or 3 centuries, and stitching them together, family by family, until individual households that vanished from living memory hundreds of years ago begin to reappear on paper, complete with birth dates, death dates, and the names of who lived under which roof. This technique, developed and refined most extensively by researchers working out of Cambridge in the latter half of the 20th century, transformed what had previously been guesswork about pre-industrial family life into something that could actually be measured. And once historians had for the first time large enough reconstructed populations to work with, they could finally ask the kind of precise question that earlier generations of scholars could only speculate about. Did a child whose household included a living grandparent actually have a measurably better chance of surviving early childhood than a child whose household did not? The answer that emerged from decades of this kind of work is neither as simple nor as dramatic as a single statistic might suggest, and it is worth walking through carefully because the nuance here matters more than the headline. Across multiple reconstructed populations in early modern England, researchers found that the presence of a co-resident or nearby grandmother correlated with modestly but consistently improved survival odds for infants and young children, particularly in the first 2 years of life, the period when a child's survival depended most heavily on constant attentive care, rather than anything a parish doctor could offer. The effect was not uniform. It appeared more strongly in poorer households than wealthier ones, which makes a certain intuitive sense once you sit with it, since wealthier families could often afford paid help to fill some of the same functions a grandmother would otherwise have provided. Among the poor, where no such substitute was financially possible, an available grandmother's presence appears to have mattered more, not less. Skeletal evidence offers a second independent line of confirmation, and it comes from a method that would have seemed like science fiction to the historian, who first began reconstructing parish families by hand. Bioarchaeologists studying isotopes preserved in ancient bone and teeth can now reconstruct with real precision patterns of childhood nutrition, specifically how long an individual was breastfed and how their diet shifted as they aged into childhood. This matters directly to our story because researchers examining burial populations from several early agricultural and medieval sites have found that children who appear through associated grave goods or burial contexts to have come from households with the surviving grandparent tend to show isotope signatures consistent with more gradual, better supported weaning, a pattern strongly associated in modern nutritional research with lower rates of the digestive illness and malnutrition that so often killed very young children in this period. None of this evidence, taken individually, would be considered conclusive on its own, and it is worth saying so honestly in the spirit this channel has always tried to hold to. A single isotope study from one burial site tells you about one small population in one specific place and time. A single parish reconstitution tells you about one village's experience shaped by its own particular mix of local disease harvest, quality, and economic circumstance. Scholars in this field are careful, appropriately careful about generalizing too far from any single data set. What makes the overall picture persuasive is not any one study, but the accumulation of many independent studies using entirely different methods in different countries across different centuries, arriving at a broadly compatible conclusion again and again. That kind of convergence, several unrelated lines of evidence pointing in roughly the same direction, is generally what historians and scientists alike consider the strongest form of proof available for a question this difficult to test directly. And yet it would be dishonest to pretend the evidence settles everything neatly, because it does not, and this is worth sitting with rather than smoothing over. Even the researchers most persuaded by this body of work acknowledge real limitations. Parish records, however, meticulously reconstructed, cannot tell us anything about the emotional quality of a given household, whether a particular grandmother was beloved or resented, patient or harsh, and it is entirely possible that some of the measured survival benefit reflects not grandmotherly warmth specifically, but simply the presence of any additional adult capable of sharing labour whether related or not. Isotope analysis, for its part, can reveal a great deal about diet, but almost nothing about who specifically made the decisions behind that diet. The evidence remains genuinely incomplete on exactly how much of the measured effect comes from a grandmother's unique accumulated knowledge, as opposed to the simpler fact of an extra pair of working hands in the household, whoever those hands happen to belong to. There is a further complication worth naming honestly, one that careful historians raise themselves: correlation of